Good evening, everyone. So today was a pretty impactful day in the realm of entertainment. Wasn't paying much attention to it at all because I could care less about the person. But what I'm speaking about is the verdict came in for Sean Combs, and like I said, I could care less about him because I don't listen to none of his stuff. But obviously there were, victims involved, or at least that's what the prosecution was saying. So the verdict came in. He was found guilty of 2 of the 5, but the 2 that he was convicted of were the minor offenses, not the major ones. So I think there was a count of racketeering, 2 counts of sex trafficking, and 2 counts of transporting prostitute over state lines, something to that effect. So he was convicted of the 2 counts of, moving, prostitution over state lines, which are the minor felonies. Then he was found not guilty of racketeering and 2 counts of sex trafficking. Of course, depending on who you listen to, will depend on the type of commentary you're going to get. I have found that most of the women commentators are upset, they're mad, that the system, the government, all this other stuff, he got away with it, blah, 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 blah. The men commentators are pretty much the opposite. Look, the prosecution didn't show enough evidence, to get convicted on sex trafficking and racketeering. And so, he got what they could prove. And that's kind of where I'm leaning towards. At first, I had the attitude of, oh yeah, he got it. He got away with it. But as I was listening to all the lawyers that are speaking on it, the prosecution didn't do a very good job of trying to prove racketeering or sex trafficking. And I think the thing the things that I think that they couldn't do it is because, when you think about racketeering, you're thinking about like mob bosses and things like that. They're literally in charge of, doing things. They couldn't prove that Sean Combs did any of that. And then the sex trafficking, they can't prove that he did any of that either. And what they allude to was the text messages from both the young ladies that were in this particular case. They have texts that said that they enjoyed it, that they wanted to be there. So if you can't prove coercion, which would be part of the sex trafficking charge, then you're not going to get that. And racketeering was a real stretch in the first place. From all the lawyers I've heard, racketeering was a stretch from the get-go. They're thinking he was the criminal mastermind behind everything. Well, they couldn't prove any of it. And those text messages from both ladies basically stated that they enjoyed what they did and they consented to it for the most part. So what did you expect the jury to render? The jury's going to go by actual hard evidence, not what people say. If they actually have hard evidence, they're going to go by that before they go off of what people say and their emotions. That's any jury. At least that's what they're supposed to do. So, do I think Sean Combs is despicable? Of course. Most definitely he's despicable. That video alone showing him beating that woman is proof enough. They should have charged him with domestic abuse. But they didn't. They'd have definitely got him a verdict on that, because there's a video showing that. And heck, even the defense, right from the get-go, said, yeah, he's an awful lousy person. Yes, he's a domestic abuser. But what has that got to do with the charges as he's being charged with? Nothing. It doesn't matter how you feel about the guy. Can you prove racketeering and sex trafficking? They couldn't. And the only thing they could prove is that he trafficked women prostitutes across state lines, which is a felony. But of course, all he's going to get is a slap on the wrist. He might only get time served, because I think he's been in prison for a year. I believe, or somewhere around there. They may just give him time served, probation, a nice fine, and rehab. That's what I'm thinking they're going to do. If he gets any prison time, I'll be shocked, honestly. And I know that each count is 10-year maximum, I believe. Maximum of 20 for both counts. He ain't going to get that. He ain't going to get that. Is he despicable and disgusting and all that? Yeah, of course he is. But unfortunately, because he has so much money and he can afford the best lawyers, you get what you pay for. You get what you pay for. You literally get what you pay for. And the prosecution, the state attorney general and all that, they failed. They failed utterly. This was almost a total victory for Sean Combs. Those two verdicts that he got for those two charges are nothing. They're nothing. They're nothing. They're absolutely nothing. And there are other people that have done the same thing that didn't get any time. So if you're going by precedence, he's definitely not going to get anything. But again, it's really, now it's dependent on the judge. What's the judge want to do? Because there's no doubt he's despicable and disgusting. There's no doubt. But guess what? He can get over that because he's rich. He got money. He's got lawyers. He's got NDAs. He's got all kinds of stuff that he can what's the word I'm looking for? He can resurrect his career and his, his public face. He can rehab it. Whatever word you want to use. I'm not saying that the ladies are lied. That they didn't go through what they say they went through. No, I'm not saying they're lying at all. But the lawyers couldn't prove it. And then you doggone you have texts that say that you enjoyed it and that you wanted to participate in them. Really? Essentially, that was the end of the case right there. When those came out, that was it. There's no way you can prove sex trafficking with those texts, because those texts, that means that they were they volunteered to be a part of it. And I'm not gonna say they were complicit, but they were, I can't think of the word now. They were they wanted to volunteer to do it. That they weren't coerced. That there was no coercion. That's what I was trying to say. That those texts proved there wasn't the coercion. What else did you want the jury to say? The jury is like, well, these texts show hard evidence that they weren't coerced. They wanted to be a part of it. They enjoyed it. They wanted to be around it. At least in these texts. It's obvious that she's a domestic abuse survivor because Sean Combs beat the mess out of her in that video. Maybe they should have charged him with that. That's probably only a misdemeanor. But still, they should have threw that in there. Because they'd have got a guilty verdict on that. Because that video was proof of that. But it wasn't a video that proved sex trafficking or racketeering. So in my opinion, the prosecution reached too far trying to make a splash, and they utterly failed. Literally, the prosecution failed. They lost the case. Sean Combs won. There's no other way you could look at it. He won. He won. Even though he was found guilty of 2 counts, he won. He won. Because he's gonna get a slap on the wrist with those 2 felony cases. No doubt. No doubt. And even if he does serve time, it's going to be minimum, maybe medium security, because of his status. They don't send too many quote unquote millionaires and people with status to maximum security prisons. Not for transporting prostitutes over the state line. No, you're not going to send them. You're not going to send him to no maximum prison. Probably not even medium security prison. Not for that. No. You're wasting a bed with that. Sex trafficking and racketeering, yes. Moving prostitutes over the state line, or the Mann Act, I think they call it. No, he ain't going to get nothing for that. I still think he got away with it, but not in the same reason that these women think he got away with it. He got away with it because the prosecution didn't have enough evidence to prove sex trafficking and racketeering. That's on the prosecution. That ain't on the defense. They didn't have enough evidence. And the evidence that the defense had, from what I heard, they didn't even spend 30 minutes on the stand. That's how confident they were in their case. And their main thing was those texts. They knew what they were doing. They knew. The defense knew. Well, how are you going to prove sex trafficking when there was no conversion according to these texts from both ladies saying that they enjoyed his company and they enjoyed the freak offs, whatever you want to call them, and all that stuff. Case is gone. It's done. It was done after they could have had the verdict days ago. And the jury did everything they could to try to get all the information they needed to try to make an informed verdict. Because yesterday they only had the verdict for 4 of the 5 counts. They still didn't have a verdict on the major one, which is the racketeering. They had to take some more time to deliberate on that one. But they come to find out, they just didn't have enough evidence. It doesn't mean that Sean Combs is not a bad person. He is. By all parameters, he is. Just by the mere fact of that video, he's a disgusting person. No doubt. But guess what? He'll live with being a disgusting person because he'll still be able to make money. And still be able to live in them big old homes he got in Miami and Los Angeles. He'll still be able to do everything that he was doing prior to him being convicted. This did nothing. This was a waste of taxpayer money. This was literally a waste of taxpayer money. This was a waste of taxpayer money because the prosecution didn't have a case and they reached too far to try to make a big splash. Oh, we're going to get Sean Combs in jail. That's going to be the best thing to happen to our careers and all this other stuff. Really? Instead of making a case that you know you can win, you reached too far and now you lost. Oh, well, and the statement they put out, they're just covering their butts. They know they lost big. They're just trying to cover their butts. Talking about the victims. You don't care nothing about the victims because if you did, you wouldn't have tried to reach so far on racketeering and sex trafficking when you know you didn't have a case. But yeah, you don't have a problem wasting taxpayer money. You'd have been better off charging it with at least 1 count of domestic violence. You'd have got a guilty verdict on that. The video is proof. You'd have got a guilty verdict on that. And even the defense lawyers admitted from the get-go in their opening statement that he wasn't a good person, that he's a domestic abuser. But what has that got to do with sex trafficking and racketeering? Zero. Nothing. And the prosecution didn't want to pursue domestic violence charges because they wanted a big splash. They wanted him they want him in prison for life. At least 20 to life. Or 15 to life. One was 20 to life, the other was 15 to life, I believe. You had no proof. You can't talk bad about the jury. You can't talk bad about the system. No, that's just a cop-out. That's a cop-out. And a lot of these female influencers on YouTube are upset because they think, well, the system failed, and because he's rich, and it's a conspiracy, and well, it may be, but let's just look at the facts. Let's just look at the evidence. Can you really sit there and tell me that they had enough to prove sex trafficking and racketeering, especially after those texts were released from the two ladies? Do you really think they had a case after that? If you're going to be honest with yourself. Yeah, he got away with it. He sure did get away with it. He might be guilty of all of it, but guess what? The prosecution couldn't prove it. And a court of law is about evidence and proof, not about hearsay and people crying on the stand. It's about proof and evidence. And again, he truly might be guilty of all those other 4 counts, but the prosecution couldn't prove it. They utterly failed. If you don't say that this was a win for Sean Combs, you in another universe. This was an absolute win for Sean Combs. Those 2 counts that he got charged for are slaps on the wrist. You'll get almost nothing for that, if anything, for that. It's an absolute win for Sean Combs. And if you're going to be mad at them prosecutors. Don't be mad at the government. Don't be mad at the system. Be mad at the prosecutors. They're the ones that failed those ladies. And it was more than just those 2. They're just the two that were willing to testify. Be mad at them prosecutors for wasting taxpayer money, for wasting time on social media because everybody and their brother was covering it. Get mad at them. Because they tried to make a splash. They tried to make themselves famous. And they utterly failed. And by all rights, the Attorney General should fire them for incompetence. Because they failed, utterly failed. The biggest court case of the year, at the very least, and the prosecution utterly failed. Utterly failed. Matlock would have did a better job prosecuting. Perry Mason would have did a better job. I ain't joking. I'm being serious. These prosecutors were idiots. All they cared about was the splash and the hype and try to make themselves look good when they didn't have the evidence for 4 of the 5 counts that they tried to charge it with. Really? I'm sorry, 3 of the 5 counts. I'm sorry, I meant to say 3 of the 5, not 4 of the 5. 3 of the 5 counts. Because he was found guilty on 2. I correct myself. I stand corrected. 3 of the 5. Be mad. If you're a woman, be mad at them prosecutors. Because they're the ones that try to make a case where there was none. They drag these women into court to testify and all this other stuff. Be mad at them prosecutors. And again, I'm not saying that they didn't endure everything that they say they endured. They probably did, but they couldn't prove it. Stop dragging folks and ruining people's lives if you ain't got no proof. You didn't do nothing to Sean Combs that he cannot recover from now. All that for what? He's going to go right back to doing whatever it was he was doing. He'll probably go right back to doing freak-offs and everything else. What did you accomplish? And I know this might sound, to some people, oh, you don't care. It's got nothing to do with caring. It's got everything to do with evidence. Nobody is saying that these women didn't go through. Just the video alone of one of them getting beat down is enough. And he should have been prosecuted for domestic violence. But that won't even be on his record. They were so stupid they didn't even include domestic violence as one of the charges. That one woman should sue him for domestic violence. She'll win. Hands down, she'll win. She got video evidence. I'm not saying that would hurt him either, but guess what? It now puts him on the radar of the government. He's a domestic abuser. They make pieces of paper that they hand out with people like that. His picture would be going around to all the churches and schools and everything else. You know, domestic violence, domestic abuser. They should have put that as one of the charges. Oh no, it wasn't good enough. They wanted to go for the gusto. Well, see where that got you? Nowhere. You know, you put these women through this whole long trial for what? For almost nothing. Almost nothing. And didn't even doggone try to prosecute the domestic abuse and violence that was on friggin' video. Slam dunk on video. What more evidence do you need? And it'd been very difficult to prove that it was a doctored video. You'd had to prove, you know what I'm saying? It's a slam dunk. The video showed he beat the mess out of her. Like that, what is it? That NFL player, what's his name? Ray Rice, I think. He did the same thing. And then the woman ended up marrying him. How crazy is that? How crazy is that? So, and some of the male influencers mainly, but some female ones too are like, you know, if Sean Combs beat her down that one time, that was one time too many. Why did she stick around? And then of course a lot of these other women are trying to make excuses. Well, once you have nowhere to go, no, you got somewhere you can go. Everybody's got somewhere they can go to get away from somebody who's beating the mess out of you. You don't sit there and take the abuse. You leave. You can go to a police station, you can go to a shelter. If you have family members, you go there. You have friends, you go there. I mean, you go to a hospital, you can go somewhere to get away from domestic violence. And again, that's not every case. I understand there are some cases where the women can't escape. I understand that. But to just to use that as a blanket excuse for sticking around in domestic violence is ridiculous. This is for men and women, because there are men that get domestic abuse too. Not as much as women, but they're out there. Man shouldn't stick around either if he's the one getting abused. All you gotta do is get beat once. But to continuously stay in an abusive relationship, the woman has to take accountability, or the man has to take accountability for that. And it's got nothing to do with compassion. It's got everything to do with the fact that you're sticking around in an abusive relationship and you choose to stay. You choose to stay. See, we're all grown folk here, and we all make decisions, and you have to live with those decisions, and all decisions have consequences. So if you choose as a man or a woman to stay in an abusive situation with domestic violence, after the first time, you should be gone. But if you continue to stay and continue to get abused, then part of that is on you. We're not saying that the abuser is right. No, we're not saying that at all. The abuser is wrong. But how wrong are you for sticking around after the first time? When is enough enough? And that's a decision only the abusee can make. The abuser wants you to stay. The abuser wants you to stay. They're the ones that are going to keep apologizing and then do it again down the road. Like a broken record. And then these texts, the according to these lawyers, said that they were even a part of these freak-offs when Sean Combs wasn't even there. So what do you want the jury to think? That means they enjoyed it. So you can't prove coercion, which is the main thing you need for sex trafficking. And they couldn't prove that he was the mastermind. Like I said, racketeering is what when you talk about racketeering, you talk about mob bosses and crime lords and stuff like that. They couldn't even prove that. But yet they didn't add domestic violence as one of the charges. I guess it wasn't high enough. You don't get enough jail time for that. Really? It boggles my mind, the different viewpoints on this case. And when in reality, you can only go by the jury verdict and the evidence that was put forward. You can't just go by what somebody says. That's just hearsay. And I'm not saying they didn't go through and what they said isn't important, or it wasn't their story, or it wasn't their experience. But you have to have evidence to back it up in a court of law. It's just that simple. It's just that simple. You have to have evidence. And for the prosecution not to have the evidence to convict on racketeering and sex trafficking, then why did you even go after him with those in the first place? Again, I still think he got away with it. I think he's a disgusting human being. And I hope this, and I hate to say this because you don't want to wish any ill will on anybody. But to be perfectly honest, I hope that this ruins his music career. Nobody should want to deal with him. Just by watching the video alone, nobody should want to deal with him. Because that's the only thing that's going to drive folk away, is that the video is out there, and that's going to be with him for the rest of his life. That's the only thing that's going to sway folks from not messing with him, doing business with him, or whatever. I hope. Not the 2 felony cases of bringing prostitutes over the state line. Heck, some of the folk that he probably worked with do the same thing. They just ain't got caught yet. Again, I'm not justifying it. I'm just looking at it purely from a evidence perspective. I can only go by what the jury put out in their verdict. They did not have unequivocal proof that Sean Combs was involved in sex trafficking or racketeering. The prosecution didn't have proof. If they did, then he'd have been convicted. Then some people say, oh, well, the jury was swayed. The jury was, awestruck because he's an entertainer. I don't believe any of that. I think that's an excuse. Because I think the lawyers do a pretty good job in sifting through jury candidates. I mean, nobody's, you might get a bad apple, but I think for the most part, juries are pretty well vetted to where, you're going to hopefully get, a fair and impartial jury. It doesn't always happen, but for the most part, I think it does. Because obviously the prosecutor wants a certain type of jurist, and the defense wants a certain type of jurist. So, you're basically going to get a jury that's kind of in the middle. Is our legal system perfect? By no stretch of imagination, is it? No, of course it's not. But using, blaming the legal system, blaming the government is a cop-out. It's a cop-out. When the real blame is on those on the prosecutors for not having enough evidence to win the case. And Sean Combs gets away with basically a slap on the wrist, and we'll find out exactly what what he's gonna, what time he's gonna have to do, if any, what his charges will be. I don't know if we'll find out today, tomorrow, next week, who knows. And again, I could care less about Sean Combs. I don't listen to none of his stuff. Honestly, I don't care about him. The only reason I'm talking about it because it's everywhere, especially social media. It's everywhere. And so I'm just giving my little 2 cents. Again, my opinions. I'm just giving my little 2 cents. And I think the women that are totally shocked and surprised by this verdict need to stop blaming everybody else and need to be going off on these prosecutors, because we know Sean Combs is a disgusting human being. There's no doubt about that. But it's not what he is, it's what you can prove. It's not emotions, it's what you can prove. A court of law is what you can prove. And they couldn't prove it, and wasted a whole lot of taxpayer money, time, and everything else because they wanted to make a big splash. It was just a whole lot of waste of time, and then, like I said, making these 2 ladies, testify and all that. All of it was a waste. What did it accomplish? Nothing. Those 2 felony counts those 2 lesser counts are absolutely nothing. It was an all-out win for Sean Combs in this case. All out win. And an absolute loss for the prosecution in the state. Absolute loss. They should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed. But even the state attorney won't be held accountable for their lackluster performance. They won't be held accountable. You brought these ladies in to testify, and all their lives are put out in front of everybody, and all this other stuff, and you won't be held accountable for your lousy performance. You didn't do your job. I understand you're going to lose cases. I understand that. Life is like, you're gonna lose in life. That's part of life. You're gonna lose. But you didn't even lose. But you lost so badly because you had no proof of sex trafficking and racketeering. It's just absolutely ridiculous. The video had nothing to do with sex trafficking or racketeering. That was domestic violence and domestic abuse. That's what that video was. And those unfortunate texts that the defense brought up only proved that the two ladies weren't coerced into going into these freak-offs and all this other stuff. The case was over with after them texts, because the defense admitted that Sean Combs is not a good man, that he's a domestic abuser. They admitted that from the opening statement. They started off with that. They were smart. Again, you get what you pay for. They were smart. They knew he was a domestic abuser. But that's not what he was being charged with. Because if he was being charged with that, they know they would have lost the case. You get what you pay for. So, it is what it is. We'll see what, the judge's verdict is. What is the sentencing, should I say. We'll see. I don't anticipate he's going to get hardly anything, if anything, to be honest. If he does get time, his time served will count towards that. He'll probably get on probation for good behavior. If he does have to serve some time, he'll get probation. He'll probably have to go through rehab. And he'll get a nice big hefty fine because he can afford it. But other than that, whatever those two ladies and others went through was all for nothing. It was all for nothing. All for nothing, in my opinion. All for nothing. And unfortunately, this sets a narrative that that you can't believe all women. That narrative has come up in the conversation. Again, I don't know if they didn't go through what they said they went through. I wasn't there, and I wasn't. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, with this verdict, that narrative is coming back up. They're talking about you need to believe women. No, you can't believe all women, because them texts just blew that out the water. They were saying all that, but then the defense presents text messages. See, Sean Combs ain't stupid. He keeps all this stuff. Why? Because one day this might happen, and you got to cover yourself. Again, I'm not saying he didn't do everything that the prosecution is accusing him of, but the prosecution could prove it. Is he a disgusting human being? He certainly is. And I hope he pays for it. But legally, he's not going to pay for it much. And probably won't pay for it socially either, to be perfectly honest. I think all the people that have been distancing themselves from Sean Combs will be right back in his corner once all this sentencing is over with. Be right back in his corner, going to his parties and doing all that stuff. And nobody will care. Nobody will care. And it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. It ain't got nothing to do with our legal system. It's got everything to do with our society and how bad our society is now. It has everything to do with that. It has everything to do with our society. And people in general, just people in general, that they would want to, do these things and be a part of all this disgusting things that people do. That people are so carnal that they want to be a part of all this stuff. That's a reflection on society and people, not a reflection of our legal system or the government. Yeah, the government is lackluster in a lot of things, but in this particular case, prosecution did an overreach, and they wanted to get a headline. They wanted to, get the splash, and the state attorney, wanted his name in lights, and all that. It wasn't about it wasn't about the defendants. It was about him. So, ladies, be mad at as a prosecutor. Be mad at him because he wanted all the limelight and everything else that came with this case. And if he would have got all his verdicts, he'd have been probably promoted and everything. He only cared about himself. He didn't care about his clients for real. Because if he did, he wouldn't have put these charges that he knew he couldn't prove. He'd have put that domestic violence charge or domestic abuse charge or multiple domestic abuse charges in there. No, they might not have got the years in jail that they would have wanted, but at least you could prove it. Domestic abuse is very serious. And again, women are the majority of it, but men are domestically abused too. So let's just be fair across the board. In this case, it was women. Could have been men, but nobody brought it up. As crazy as his parties were, I'm sure. But you need proof. Proof is everything. Evidence is everything. You can't just believe somebody. You got to have proof. And you talk to these lawyers, and most of them will tell you, yeah, prosecution just failed, utterly failed. They didn't have a case. They didn't have a case. They did not have a case. They failed, utterly. They utterly failed. So, I don't know what else to say. That's just my 2 cents, my opinion. Again, these are my opinions. What I've watched on today, and I really didn't want to watch it, but again, it's the biggest current event right now, so I decided to talk about it. Really, like I said, don't care about Sean Combs at all. But I figured I'd come on here and talk about give my 2 cents. So that's it. So again, like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. If you like the content, share the content. If you have a comment, by all means, put it down there. As always, be respectful. That's all I ask, is be respectful in your comments. You don't have to agree, just be respectful. There's always two sides to a story, and there's always different opinions, because everybody doesn't have the same life experiences and opinions. And that's okay. That's okay. Okay? That's okay. But be respectful. And so that's it. So until next time, y'all, God bless you.